I just like to do a kind of special deep dive into FIFA. You know, there's so much coverage about all the other topics that I figured let's talk about something different today. Not saying, obviously, the other issues in the world right now are not important, but yeah, just wanted to switch it up. So, FIFA is the Federal International Football Association. It's actually the French word of that, but for the sake of me not butchering it, we're just going to call it that. The relevance of this is that the World Cup will be taking place in November of 2020 in Qatar. People might be going, wait, November 2022? What? Isn't it usually in the summer? You would be correct. It's usually in the summer. But it's happening then because, well, if you look at where Qatar is, summers are brutal. As far as I've understood, it can get as hot as like 120, 130 degrees there. And yeah, it's not ideal for playing football or / soccer. And so yeah, they've moved it to November, and we're going to get into that later because basically the whole international communities had to basically be flexible just for Qatar to make money, basically. But I'll stop the rant for now. But the reason I want to talk about FIFA is because since the invasion of Ukraine, there have been talks of banning Russia, but then also there's been worries that people were going to let the Russian team play under a different name, much like what happened in the Winter Olympics. Russia, you know, the doping scandal, so the Russian team wasn't allowed, but then you also had the Russian Olympic Committee, which in my opinion was bullshit. I mean, it's like, okay, we see what you're doing. You can cheat and we'll still let you play because of money, basically. But I luckily saw that in February, FIFA did suspend Russia from the World Cup, and that's promising. You know, it shouldn't even be a debate, considering just how atrocious the Putin regime is behaving. But as I was thinking about this, and it's the reason I want to talk about this today, is that I've kind of looked back through my mind and remembered just the stories I've seen over the years about how corrupt FIFA is, how the Qatar games will be controversial at best, how close to 1 million people could potentially die building these stadiums for the 2022 games, and how these stadiums are built, wasteful, and never used again. So I think it's just a good time to dive into this, you know, and while I've been back in Tahoe, I was with my dad at a restaurant one night, and we met a guy who's a soccer fan, and he was like, "You should do a deep dive into FIFA." And yeah, I think it's a good idea. So just for a quick background for those who do not watch soccer, football, FIFA is a nonprofit organization that describes itself as basically an international governing body of association football, futsal, and beach soccer. And it's the highest governing body of association football. It was founded in France in 1904, and its headquarters is in Geneva, Switzerland, of course. That just seems really fitting to me for some reason. I'm not sure why, maybe the neutrality thing. Anyways, also something interesting that I just learned today is that there is a strategic alliance between FIFA and the United Nations, which was signed in 1999. And if you think about it, FIFA is almost kind of a United Nations in some ways, except, you know, it also does allow in despots and murderous regimes and nations that would never be admitted to the United Nations, right? But it is an organization that could be seen as providing importance for many causes, right, and UN values. So it makes sense. But as we discuss, it's not always so sunny. So starting with this article from Duke University, it's called "The Dark Side of FIFA: Selected Controversies and the Future of Accountability in the Organization." And the article basically just gives us some examples of how much clout FIFA has in the world and how this organization has been involved in good and a lot of bad. So the author is Christina Maliris, and she writes here in quotes that FIFA exerts quite an important influence over the rest of the world. And she gives a few examples of the positives, which include the organization's acts in South Africa, which was near the end of apartheid. And actually South Africa, during that time, FIFA's involvement in the country actually helped contribute to the end of the system because the terms they put on South Africa put a lot of pressure on the apartheid regime. So that's a positive for sure. And you can see that, you know, soccer does bring people and cultures together. And I think that's a big thing we do need to remember is that, you know, sports are good in some ways. Also, the article mentions that when Nigeria was finally allowed into the league, it was a major breakthrough for national unity of the country. And there was for a little bit, there was actually a semblance of unity and a shared purpose, right? And I think that is one of the biggest positives of FIFA. You know, I lived in Spain for about 4 years, and I just remember thinking, like, Spain has a lot of cultural division. The autonomous regions have a lot of differences. And watching them all wave the Spanish flag and wear their red and yellow and cheer on the team, people seem to forget about their differences. So I think that's something really important. Now, before we get into more specific issues with FIFA, because there's definitely a lot of them, I think it's just important to note that FIFA is it's a non-governmental organization. So obviously it has to adhere to international law, but there's times where the regulatory body is just not there. And so there's a lot of internal issues that maybe international government organizations or NGOs or nonprofits sometimes don't have the same issues with. And so I first want to go into probably, to me, the most troubling one, which I don't think gets enough coverage. Obviously, people talk about the corruption and bribery, which we'll get to later. But to me, it's labor practices and potential human rights violations, which are probably the biggest issues. The first controversy is kind of how the host countries in general are not always places that have the best labor practices or human rights laws or protections. And this comes up a lot with Qatar for the 2022 games because I think it's the most glaring example. The games that are occurring there in the winter, as I said, there's a lot of shady labor practices in the World Cup building efforts, putting up the stadiums, installing infrastructure, etc. However, there have been troubling reports on the deaths of Nepalese people who are working on these sites. Also back during the games in South Africa, I think, over a decade ago now, there were workers' strikes over allegations that the workers were working more than 18 hours a day, and it was for like 190 rand, which I saw as close to 20 euros. So you're working 18 hours a day for 20 bucks, basically. 22 bucks, I guess, if we're doing dollars. So also another recent example is the overscheduled expansion processes, which happened at the Sao Paulo airport in Brazil to anticipate increased traffic during the World Cup, which happened again probably 7-8 years ago. And this actually led to an investigation by the BBC, which found migrant workers living in just atrocious conditions and being paid barely anything. And that seems to be a trend throughout the Olympics as well. This is just to step back for a second. A lot of these issues that we're seeing with FIFA, you could probably say a lot of them are similar with the Olympics. So just keep that in mind, is that a lot of these international, like the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is just as flawed. But for the sake of today, I didn't want to talk about that. So to go into the Qatar example, it's the most recent, so I think it's the one we'll really focus on. Basically, Amnesty International has an article that discusses how, in quotes here, without the 2 million migrant workers, the 2022 World Cup simply would not be possible in Qatar. Men and women, mostly from Africa and Asia, are building the stadiums, the roads, the metro, etc. The article also mentions that in 2017, the Qatari government signed an agreement with the International Labour Organization, promising to tackle widespread labor exploitation. However, this does not seem to have occurred, and it's probably because, I don't know how much you guys know about Qatar's system, but they have a pretty corrupt and exploitative labor system that really relies on something that is not technically slave labor, but it's getting borderline there. And the system is called the kafala system, and it's basically sponsorship-based employment, which legally binds foreign employees to their employers, or foreign refugees, foreign migrants, etc., to their employers. Now, in theory, that sounds good. Like, bring over immigrants from a poor country and give them a better situation, right? But the reports I've seen over the years, and this Amnesty International article also brings this up, is that many companies will destroy these workers' passports and then ban them from leaving the country entirely. So this kind of traps these workers in cycles of abuse and something close to slavery. So they basically destroy their documents and then force them to work, and then because of this system, they are obligated legally to work for their employer unless their employer lets them leave. And so it's just a very depressing cycle. And if you guys just type in on Google some of the cities in Qatar and see what they looked like 30 years ago compared to now, they've sprung up almost overnight. And a lot of that has been done through exploitative labor like this. And now for this 2022 games, a lot of these stadiums are going to be built by these exact people who are trapped, basically. Now, to be fair, just because I want to give you the full picture, is that Qatar did make important progress, which included ending something called the no objection certificate requirement, which allows employees to change jobs without the permission of their employer. I know, 21st century, and we're talking about this still, but So they are allowed to apparently leave their jobs without the permission of their employer, but I don't know if that's really going to solve anything, because if you're still considered kind of a second-class citizen and all these companies are exploitative, where are you going to go? Like, what are you going to go back to your country if they've taken your documents? You're going to go to another organization or employer that might just be as bad? Like, I don't know if it's really solving anything, but it does look good rhetorically on paper. And also, FIFA has pushed back on this, but it looks like it's more just in rhetoric and media. I'm hesitant honestly, I'm just hesitant to believe that change is coming, because they've been building this infrastructure and these stadiums for half a decade now. So I don't think, as I've mentioned, because we'll get into Brazil and South Africa as well, I don't think building this infrastructure in these stadiums so quickly is really possible without exploitative practices, basically. If the system is built around a quick and expensive infrastructure project, it cannot be accomplished without these, just atrocious living conditions and means, honestly. One thing I also didn't really know about much until today is that the exploitation doesn't just stop at the workers and the builders. There's also a documentary called Soccer's Lost Boys that I believe came out in 2010, and it looks at how the exploitation goes towards the players themselves. Because, if you become Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi or whatever, there's a lot of fame and wealth and just power in your future. And this organization really does use this to exploit players. And there's just reports of a lot of young Africans who were kind of promised fame and wealth and got used, abused, and just taken advantage of by agents and the company, and really found no outcome and just ended up back where they started. And so, it's just greed at its best, I think you could say. And, staying on this actual just kind of wasteful and exploitative labor practice, the second big issue I have with FIFA is just the wasteful infrastructure. Many of the countries that have hosted FIFA, and this is a big thing that I don't think people talk about enough, all of these countries don't have the stadiums or infrastructure in place, and they had to build all of them from scratch. And this is problematic when you think about how many stadiums a lot of Europe, Asia, and the US actually has, right? So I just wonder, why build stadiums in the Amazon, for example, when the Brazilian World Cup happened, when the UK has way than enough stadiums to do this, or the United States, Mexico. It just kind of blows my mind when you think about it. So basically, that Duke University article from earlier, mentions that, in quotes here, talking about Qatar, that is, in quotes, the tiny country did not have the infrastructure to support this endeavor, meaning they had to build everything from scratch. A strange place for a World Cup, when there are many other countries who have plenty of infrastructure to accommodate the event, end quotes. And a 2014 article from the UC Berkeley Political Review discusses how wasteful the Brazilian World Cup also was. It talks about how the Brazilian World Cup was one of the most popular based on ratings, but now the majority of the stadiums that were built sit empty. And the article mentions one stadium that is important to look at. It reads here in quotes, "In the heart of the Amazon, the World Cup stadium built in Manaus took $300 million to build and has failed to find a permanent use. Manaus doesn't house a single top division team, and its most popular club, Nacional, plays in the 4th division and draws just a couple thousand fans a game. Given the stadium's 44,500 seat capacity, such numbers are alarming. Stadiums like the one in Manaus cannot find a permanent use because they are too expensive for small local teams to use," end quotes. And honestly, as I'm recording this, I'm looking at a picture of this stadium, and you just see, I tell you to look it up. I mean, there's just green plants and overgrowth just taking it over, and you're like, God, $300 million. It's just problematic when you think about the extreme poverty, and the extreme poverty being a crucial issue in Brazil, and all this money that was wasted on a stadium. And it boosted tourism, and it boosted TV ratings for a couple weeks, but it mainly helped FIFA. It looks like it didn't really help Brazil very much. And the UC Berkeley article also continues that this issue is not just in Brazil. The article mentions that in 2010, South Africa spent nearly $2 billion on 6 stadiums, which were built to host its World Cup matches. And apparently, they had... This is fun. They had stadiums that could have been used And all they needed to do was renovate them, but they were in impoverished districts, and FIFA refused to allow them to do this. So instead, they built these just new 6 stadiums for $2 billion. And the sad thing is that if they had have renovated these stadiums in the more impoverished districts, it would have benefited the local communities from economic stimulus, jobs, stability. Now, it's just then you have to talk about the cost of maintaining the stadiums, which some of these countries just can't afford. And these stadiums in South Africa, much like in Brazil, are barely being used now, and they're just sitting there. And there's just so many issues I have with that. And, like I said earlier, there's a lot of mirrors of this in the Olympics as well. Chinese stadiums have had these same problems. The Olympics in Brazil had these same problems. But, it's just when there's so much inequality and destruction in the world, to spend this type of money for basically 2 weeks, just so FIFA can get good ratings, basically, it's not stimulating the economy long term. And it's just exploiting people and taking up wasteful space, in my opinion. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that's just how I feel on that. Because believe me, I could rant to you guys for probably hours about that. But moving on, there's also just and this is probably the main issue that gets covered, is the issue of corruption, financial mismanagement, and bribery, and just clear felony activity. And this also leads to a worrying trend of the organization just buddying up with despots, tyrants, and illiberal regimes. And obviously this is relevant with Russia right now as well. And so there's a New York Times article called "The U.S. Says FIFA Officials Were Bribed to Award World Cups to Russia and Qatar." And it was published in 2020, updated in 2021. And it goes into detail on this issue because we have to remember that some of the previous World Cups, Qatar, well, not previous for Qatar, but the previous one was in Russia. I just love how both the Olympics and FIFA have been in Russia, as, Putin's been kind of doing some quite shitty things for a long time. And it's about money, because this New York Times article talks about after years of investigations, officials found that representatives from Russia and Qatar had just, outright bribed FIFA officials in order to make sure that they would get hosting rights for the World Cup. The indictment, which was handed out back in 2020, also involved media officials and a sports marketing company, in which it was found that they were involved in wire fraud, money laundering, and connection with bribes to secure television and marketing rights for international soccer tournaments. So, again, I don't have to reiterate it, but I will. It's clear that FIFA doesn't care about the love of the game. it's money and television rights. One part of this article talks about how 3 South American officials received payments to vote for Qatar. Others received payments back in 2010 before the Russian World Cup. And ironically, not ironically, just uniquely, I guess you could say, 2 of these officials I mentioned have died. And 1 is still in Brazil, but I guess the United States doesn't have an extradition treaty, so they can't bring this guy over to talk. So 2 out of the 3 have been disposed, and 1 is not talking. Fun stuff. Something else also of note in this article is that it says, in quotes, more than half the people involved in the votes for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, including the former FIFA president Sepp Blatter, who is a piece of unique waste in my opinion, have been accused of wrongdoing, though not necessarily criminally charged. So, yeah, Sepp Blatter, you guys should look up him too. He's a piece. He's a piece of work. But it's just worrying that more than half the people that were involved in the votes for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups were somehow accused of wrongdoing and bribery. Yeah, I'm going to have to start really looking into where all these World Cups are happening. Now, I'm hoping down the road, maybe after these games, maybe they'll start reconsidering where they do these when the numbers go down. But anyways, all of this is linked to something called the FIFA corruption scandal that really rocked the organization in 2015. And it led to several nations opening up investigations into many, many top officials. And according to a BBC report at the time, the scandal erupted in May, where there was a raid on a luxury hotel in Zurich. And just this one raid led to the arrest of 7 FIFA executives. Then, if that wasn't scandalous enough, in the same month, but just later, the U.S. indicted 14 current and former FIFA officials and their associates. And the charges were mainly focused on rampant, systematic, and deep-rooted corruption, following an investigation and inquiry by the FBI. And this is all linked with, I think, the internal dynamics, bribery, how they choose their venues, etc., etc. And the scandal was not over after this, because then in December, 16 more officials were actually charged following the arrest of two FIFA vice presidents as well. So yeah, not great when the higher ups are involved in this as well. And then there's the former Brazil Football Federation chief, Ricardo Teixeira, and he was among those accused of, in quotes, being involved in criminal schemes involving well over $200 million in bribes and kickbacks, end quotes. So, call me crazy, but it seems like this was not just a one-time mistake, right? All these people are getting caught. And from what I gathered, this is actually mainly due to whistleblowers. That was how a lot of this information was gathered. And I've always, been a hesitant supporter of whistleblowing. Now, there's also been, I think just I mentioned at the top of the show, I think there's a lot of problems with these types of organizations, and even the UN could fall into this in some ways as well. The IOC, International Olympic Committee, as well, where there seems to be a disregard for actually working only with countries with high values and belief in human rights. I would not be surprised if China's going to have a World Cup in 5 or 10 years. And that's my thing, is that the rhetoric is all about unity and human rights and democracy and values. But when you really dig deep, it's like these organizations are just about the money, and they'll pretty much let you do a World Cup anywhere. Now, all the gloomy aside, I was wondering this, I'm sure you might be as well. How can something like this be reformed, right? And obviously, I love football, soccer, whatever you want to call it. A lot of people do as well. So we're not going to get rid of the World Cup. Though I'm actually more into La Liga, the Premier League, Bundesliga, stuff like that. Like, I actually prefer the more club games. But FIFA's always fun. It's fun to have people over, watch the games, cheer on your countries, have some beers, you know what I mean. But I found a really good piece by Stephen Bank, and it was published first in the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, and it was written in 2019. So post all these scandals and post the spotlight being on the corruption and just human rights abuses in some of these countries, and it focuses on reform. It's called Reform from the Inside, and it probably doesn't come as a shock to any of you that FIFA has been focusing on reform since this scandal broke in 2015. And in this law journal, Banks basically discusses how attempts at reform have taken many pages from the U.S. corporate governance playbook, in which independent actors are brought in to keep a balance, right, between management and the shareholders, basically bringing in outsiders to fix the problem and add more oversight. And Banks writes that most of these reforms have focused on attempting to break the cycle, in quotes here, of corruption among football insiders by bringing in more outsiders, including independent chairs of both the Ethics Committee and Audit and Compliance Committee, as well as individuals to serve in executive positions who have not been previously involved in the sport at any level. End quotes. And I would just add right there is that I don't know if you want to bring in people who are not involved in the sport at any level. I don't know if that's particularly going to be an effective reform strategy. And Banks seems to agree, and he doesn't think that bringing in outsiders and compliance committees and audits and evaluations is really going to be the solution. He brings up really an astute point about how FIFA does not have the same government oversight or pressure from donors that even non-profits have in the United States and other countries. And this means that outsiders are really not the problem, which is probably not a surprise after what we've talked about. But it's really the insiders, and this must be reformed. He cites examples of how it was the insiders prior to 2014 who blew the whistle, right, on the illegal activities happening in the organization. He writes here in quotes that these so-called whistleblowers had better access to information and were more dedicated to FIFA's mission to foster the development of and growth of the sport than any outsider would be, end quotes. And I think that's a good point, because you want the people who actually are passionate and involved in the organization to speak out when they need to, not some outsider who maybe doesn't understand the organization's culture to come in and try to change it. And I honestly think creating safety nets for whistleblowers and creating support networks for employees who care about doing the right thing is a good start. Now, obviously, this would not solve all of the issues. It would solve some of them, and I think always allowing people to speak out creates an incentive to do so. But then again, you have to look at the elephant in the room too. Is that the whole business strategy of FIFA is just about ratings and growth and expanding FIFA, because they have so many subdivisions around the world that they're always trying to grow. And I just don't know how you stop the greed or the flashy infrastructure projects that go to waste or the slave-like labor. It's difficult. I do just want to end with kind of an interesting little segment from a book called "Why Should We Care?" And it's a It's a research paper out of the University of Colorado, and I just read some of the chapters in it. I didn't read the whole thing, but I read kind of the parts about reform. And it's from the University of Colorado, and it's about the problem of holding FIFA accountable. And the article talks about, in quotes here, and I'm just going to read it, so bear with me. Accountability of FIFA matters for the governance of the sport, the business of football, and to the larger issue of the accountability of international organizations. Soccer may be simply a game, but with its overwhelming popularity and international reach, it has its feet in international politics, human rights, major business transactions, and many other categories. If the governing body of this sport is not conducting business with integrity, it would certainly have a negative effect on the other things that football is a part of. End quotes. And I will end it with that, because I think it's a really good point. And something we have to remember is that this type of rot and corruption and moral malfeasance, it's not going to stay in FIFA. And obviously we know it isn't. But accountability is key. And without accountability and reconciliation, you can really never progress or grow. So you guys can find me as always on the YouTube, Twitter, Apple Podcasts, Facebook, iTunes, Spotify, Podbean. And I'll be back Monday. So take care. Thanks, guys.